Mr. Henderson, those weren't burial sites, they were infrastructure impediments. That's what Victoria Lansing said to me. Standing there in the churned-up earth where 15 headstones used to rest, the earliest one carved in 1887. Exhaust fumes still thick in the morning air, the wrought iron fencing crushed into scrap metal behind her, tablet computer in hand, expression perfectly composed. 135 years of history erased in one weekend, demolished to create space for the seventh fairway of a golf facility that perhaps 14 people in our community actually visited. I stood there and made her a commitment she dismissed as empty words. She shouldn't have dismissed it. What would you do if someone looked at where your ancestors rest and labeled them infrastructure impediments? Tell me in the comments, because what happened next required 21 months, 4 attorneys, 2 county officials, and one particularly memorable Thursday afternoon at the Riverside County Administration Building. Where are you joining from tonight? Let me know, because this story is for anyone who's faced down a minor authority figure trying to control their existence with bureaucratic paperwork. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Marcus Henderson, former industrial electrician, 33 years running commercial electrical systems across 5 states, mostly Oregon, some Washington, a period in Nevada I prefer not to recall because of the heat. I operate a 2010 Silverado with a faded paint job and a passenger seat that permanently carries the scent of coffee and leatherwork gloves. The most aggressive thing I'd ever done before this situation was dispute a referee's call at a youth soccer game, and I was completely wrong about that call. I relocated to Meadowbrook Estates in the autumn of 2020, 3 years after my wife Catherine died. My son Daniel believed the community would be beneficial for me. Manageable property, built-in social structure, no more existing alone in that old farmhouse. Meadowbrook sat on the eastern edge of Riverside County, Oregon. Gentle slopes, mature oak trees, that distinctive combination of pine sap and damp soil that settles after an afternoon rain and makes everything feel temporarily manageable. It was genuinely beautiful, I'll acknowledge that much. What the promotional materials failed to mention was Victoria Lansing. Victoria had occupied the position of Homeowners Association president for 8 years. She ran without opposition every election cycle, not because residents appreciated her leadership, but because nobody desired the position enough to challenge her authority. She maintained a laminated planning binder. It contained labeled sections. She held positions on your exterior lighting choices, your garage door color, the exact permitted shade of tan your window trim could display. She implemented regulations that existed nowhere in official documents and created additional ones verbally in real time with the assured confidence of someone who had never questioned whether she might be incorrect. Our first interaction occurred when she appeared at my door 3 days after my arrival. She carried the laminated binder and wore professional business attire on a Sunday at 10 in the morning. She informed me in the patient, instructional tone typically reserved for explaining basic safety to children that my waste containers were 4 inches too visible from the roadway, that my Silverado exceeded the dimensional requirements for visitor parking areas, and that my decorative hanging chimes, a copper set Daniel had given me the previous Christmas, potentially violated Section 8.3 of the governing documents. Section 8.3 contained no mention of decorative chimes whatsoever. I verified that same day, but I relocated them inside regardless because I remained exhausted from relocating, and I hadn't yet understood that Victoria Lansing interpreted every accommodation as permanent capitulation. What I also didn't know then, at the remote southeastern section of the Meadowbrook Estates property, concealed behind a dense grouping of old hemlock trees, existed a small family cemetery, 15 burial sites belonging to the Patterson family, who had cultivated this land before transferring ownership to a development company in 1971. That transaction included a deed covenant filed with Riverside County. In explicit language, those burial sites were to remain permanently undisturbed. That specific word, permanently, appeared directly in the recorded document. 4 families in the community maintained awareness of these graves. The Washington family, the only African-American household on our street, had a great-grandmother who had been employed on the Patterson farm. The Kowalski family, Polish immigrants, first generation, had a grandfather whose marker stood among the Pattersons through marriage into that agricultural community. And elderly Bernard Sullivan, 85 years old, widower, 3-year resident, who placed fresh wildflowers there every spring. He had known those graves his entire adult existence and visited them with absolute regularity. None of them possessed any reason to suspect the graves faced danger. The deed covenant had been officially recorded. It represented binding legal obligation. Then, in March of 2023, Victoria submitted a proposal to expand the community's 12-hole golf facility by 4 additional holes. The board, 5 individuals she personally selected to fill vacant positions, individuals who had discovered that agreeing with her created less difficulty than arriving at meetings prepared to disagree, approved it in 13 minutes at 8 in the morning, announced through a 3-line mention buried in the monthly newsletter bulletin. By July, the hemlocks were stumps. By September, the graves had vanished. The morning I discovered this was a Wednesday in mid-September, the type of morning where humidity sits heavy on everything, buzzing with insects, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass and hot asphalt from road maintenance 2 streets away. Bernard Sullivan had telephoned me just after 8, his voice breaking so severely I had to request twice that he speak more slowly. I drove to the southeastern corner of the property and exited my truck. What I discovered was active construction, freshly exposed earth the color of rust. The hemlock stumps showed raw, pale centers, still releasing sap that caught the morning sunlight. The smell struck me physically: diesel exhaust, overturned clay, that sharp mineral quality of soil that had remained undisturbed for a century and resented the intrusion. The wrought iron fencing that had enclosed the graves lay twisted in a loose pile near the tree line, bent at angles that metal only achieves when something massive passes through without slowing. The headstones had disappeared, all 15 of them. An excavator sat 50 feet distant, engine silent, still releasing heat as it cooled. A crow observed me from the nearest stump with the patient attention of a creature that has learned humans eventually do something interesting. Victoria stood near the excavator with her tablet. She observed my approach. She didn't move. "I understand what you're going to say," she stated before I could speak. Her tone matched the one she employed for compliance notifications: patient, firm, the verbal equivalent of a closing door. The board possesses complete authority over common property areas. This represented a properly authorized infrastructure project. "There were burial sites here," I said. "There was an informal memorial area," she responded, and she actually created small air quotation gestures with 2 fingers of her tablet hand, which was not registered with the county and carried 0 legal protection. I knew immediately that she was lying. Not suspected, knew, because 4 months earlier, Gerald Washington had mentioned the Patterson plot to me casually, and I'd done what I always do when something captures my interest. I researched it. Riverside County Recorder website, 25 minutes of searching. The deed covenant was documented there clearly. November 1971, explicit language, binding on all subsequent property owners. Here's what you need to understand, and I want you to really hear this. I hadn't considered it significant at the time, because why would I? Who disturbs burial sites? "I'd like to examine the documentation for your county verification," I said. She smiled. It was an expression I had begun to recognize: broad, patient, the smile of someone who has never needed to justify herself to anyone who mattered. "I'll have our legal representative compile a summary." "I'd like the actual documents." "Of course," she said, and she noted something on her tablet. I drove directly to the Riverside County Recorder office. The attorney's summary arrived 5 days later, 3 pages, no case numbers, no deed references, citing only a vague title examination by an unnamed party, the type of document designed to appear official while containing nothing verifiable. That was Victoria's opening move: paper as defensive armor. Generate official-appearing material, speak with absolute confidence, and rely on most people not knowing what legitimate documentation looks like. My countermove required 1 afternoon and $23. I obtained the original deed records myself, had them certified, and created 7 copies: 1 for Gerald Washington, 1 for Anna Kowalski, the daughter who worked as a legal assistant in Portland, 1 for Bernard Sullivan, 1 for the Riverside Tribune, 2 for myself, 1 for safekeeping. Then I contacted the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office. Here's something worth understanding, and I encourage you to actually research this for your own state, because this type of law exists virtually everywhere and almost nobody uses it. Under Oregon's historic preservation statutes, disturbing a cemetery or burial ground without legal authorization represents a criminal offense, not a civil matter. Criminal. The State Historic Preservation Office possesses investigatory authority and can refer cases to the Attorney General's office. Destroying graves isn't merely morally catastrophic. In Oregon, it can constitute a felony. Takeaway: if someone disturbs a burial site in your state, don't begin with a strongly worded complaint letter. Begin with your state's Historic Preservation Office. The contact number is almost always on your state government's website within 3 clicks. The Preservation Office sent investigator Patricia Morrison, compact, silver-haired, early 50s, with the quiet intensity of someone who had performed this work long enough that each new case made her not sadder, but more precise. She examined the site for 3 hours. She collected samples, photographed the stump fields and the raw earth and the twisted wrought iron fencing, and asked me exactly one question before departing. "Mr. Henderson, don't go anywhere." Meanwhile, Victoria sent an email to the entire community that same week, describing the golf course expansion as a community-approved beautification initiative, and inviting everyone to a ribbon-cutting celebration at the new 7th Fairway the following Saturday. She included directions. She included a suggested attire guideline: business casual. I am not exaggerating. Business casual for a ribbon cutting over a cemetery. The woman possessed audacity you could measure in geological terms. The ribbon cutting never occurred. The State Historic Preservation Office issued a cease and desist order on the construction project the day prior. Orange state agency markers appeared in the ground where the 7th Fairway was scheduled, and by Friday afternoon, 2 Preservation Office vehicles occupied the access road with their warning lights activated. I happened to be passing when Victoria observed the markers from across the fairway. I want to be careful about what I state here because I am a person who attempts to be fair, but the expression that crossed her face in that moment, a flicker of something she immediately covered with her default smile, was among the more satisfying things I have witnessed in my 65 years on this earth. She recovered quickly. That was the characteristic of Victoria. She was fast. She had been, I would discover, fast her entire adult life, which probably explained why she had gone unchallenged for so long. She retained a real estate attorney named Preston Clark, brought a black BMW, wore expensive watches to outdoor meetings, that type, and Preston filed a letter claiming the deed covenant was unenforceable because the original Patterson family had no living descendants to uphold it. That argument possessed just enough legal substance to be dangerous. If there was nobody with legal standing to enforce the covenant, it might be challenged in court. Victoria was betting that the families most affected, the Washingtons, the Kowalskis, elderly Bernard, lacked either the resources or the endurance to fight. She was wrong on both counts, but she didn't know that yet. Anna Kowalski had been working with genealogy databases for 3 weeks. She located Thomas Patterson, 76, retired librarian, Eugene, Oregon, who had not known his family's graves had been destroyed until Anna telephoned him on a Thursday evening. She told me afterward that the line went very quiet for an extended time. Then he said, "Tell me who I need to contact." Thomas drove to Riverside the following Monday. He was tall, lean, deliberate, wire-rimmed glasses, the unhurried movements of a man who had spent decades working with historical documents and had learned that patience was not weakness, but strategy. He walked the site without speaking for an extended time, hands in his jacket pockets, boots crunching on gravel. The raw earth had begun drying by then, cracking at the surface in that particular way that makes disturbed ground resemble something wounded healing incorrectly. When he finally spoke, he said, "My great-grandfather is under there somewhere," flat and factual, the way you state something that is simply terribly true. With Thomas as a plaintiff, Preston Clark's standing argument collapsed. He pivoted to a new angle, filing for a declaratory judgment claiming the deed covenant had been abandoned through non-enforcement. This is a legitimate legal doctrine. If a restriction goes unchallenged long enough, courts can sometimes rule it lapsed. Critical thing to know, and this one you really should save. Deed covenants on cemeteries in Oregon are specifically exempt from abandonment doctrine under case law from State v. Morrison, 1992. They do not lapse. The state legislature decided, apparently with rare good judgment, that you shouldn't be able to bulldoze a cemetery just because nobody sued you about it for 30 years. Most states have equivalent protections. Our attorney, Rebecca Stone, quiet, meticulous, exclusively wore gray, charged reasonable rates, and possessed the energy of someone maintaining a very specific list, filed a motion to dismiss Preston's declaratory action on those exact grounds. Judge Margaret Torres agreed in a brief ruling that felt like a rebuke. 4 paragraphs. The final sentence noted that the moving party's interpretation of the governing documents was strained beyond credibility. Rebecca read me that sentence over the phone. We were both quiet for a moment in appreciation. But Victoria still controlled the board, she still controlled the HOA's finances, she still set the meeting schedules, and as long as she held that institutional machinery, she could keep spending resident dues on attorneys and keep the legal process grinding. Victoria still held the board. She still controlled the HOA's finances, she still established the meeting calendar, and as long as she possessed that institutional machinery, she could continue expending resident dues on attorneys, keep the legal process grinding forward, and keep the rest of the community insulated from what was actually occurring. So, I organized a neighborhood gathering, not an HOA meeting, those required her approval, a community assembly, held in my backyard on a mild October Saturday evening, with folding chairs borrowed from the Methodist church 3 blocks away, a cooler filled with cold beverages, and string lights Daniel helped me suspend between the fence posts. 32 of the neighborhood's 48 households attended. I arranged everything on a folding table: the deed covenant, the preservation office's cease and desist, the dismissed declaratory judgment, Preston Clark's 3-page attorney summary beside the actual county records it was supposed to represent. I did not editorialize. I allowed the documents to sit there side by side and perform the work themselves. The room went quiet. Then it went the other kind of loud. Margaret Stone, retired school superintendent, 24 years on the street, had never once publicly opposed Victoria, stood up and said in the voice of someone spending something they'd saved for a long time, "She lied to us." 2 words, the room shifted. You could feel it the way air shifts before a storm. Victoria responded to the backyard gathering with what I can only describe as administrative fury. Within 7 days, 18 households received violation notices: lawn height, fence visibility, a skateboard ramp 3 inches past the setback line, my truck again in a spot I had been using for 4 years without incident. One family got cited for a compost bin that wasn't, and I want to be precise here, aesthetically integrated into the surrounding landscape architecture. Their compost bin was brown. It was behind a hedge. I went and examined it myself. It was completely acceptable. The citations were retaliation, and everyone recognized it, and Victoria didn't even attempt to make them subtle, which told me something. She was rattled. Petty tyrants lean hardest on the machinery when the machinery is the only thing they have remaining. Here's what most people don't know about HOA violation notices, and this is genuinely useful information. They are only as powerful as the governing documents permit them to be. The Meadowbrook Estates governing documents required written notice, then a 30-day correction period, then a formal hearing before the board before any fine could be levied. Rebecca walked all 18 cited residents through the process. We requested hearings for every single citation simultaneously, and we appeared at each one with documentation. The board meetings became 4-hour events. Victoria, who had been conducting them in 12 minutes for 8 years because she was essentially conversing with herself, began visibly running out of the particular energy that comes from never being challenged. She started arriving with more coffee. Her binder got thicker. Then she went to the press, not the Riverside Tribune, which had been covering the Graves story with appropriate sympathy. She went to the Meadowbrook Gazette, a neighborhood publication, whose editor, a man named Mitchell, happened to be her brother-in-law. The headline was, "Activist Faction Threatens Community Harmony with Coordinated Legal Campaign." The article described me as a recently relocated outsider with unclear motives and quoted an unnamed board member suggesting the situation had generated fear from long-term residents. It did not mention the Graves once. I read it twice. I showed it to Rebecca. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she circled the phrase "unclear motives" and the word "outsider" with a mechanical pencil and said, "She's leaving fingerprints." She was correct, because the smear attempt did what amateur smear attempts always do when there's a real journalist paying attention. It drew exactly the wrong kind of attention. Christopher Reyes at the Portland Observer had been tracking the State Historic Preservation Office investigation and the court filings for weeks. Now he had a neighborhood newsletter calling a retiree an outsider for objecting to the demolition of graves. He called me on a Tuesday. The story ran the following Monday. By Friday, it had been picked up by an Oregon news aggregator. By Friday, it was on a national cemetery preservation watchdog. Victoria started receiving emails from people in states she probably never thought about. She made one more move before things fully unraveled. She called an emergency board meeting, just the 6 of them, no community notice, technically permissible under a rarely invoked clause, and used it to authorize an additional $45,000 in HOA legal fees from the Community Reserve Fund. $45,000 from dues paid by families to keep fighting a man over his great-grandfather's grave. That authorization was, as it turned out, the thread that unraveled the whole sweater, because Stephen Martinez, a quiet accountant who had been on the board for 3 years and who I strongly suspect had been profoundly unhappy for approximately 34 months of that tenure, forwarded the emergency meeting minutes to Rebecca, and Rebecca found the number that changed everything. The HOA's facility maintenance reserve had been funded for 4 years at $18,000 annually. The balance should have been $72,000. The actual balance, per the most recent financial statement, was $4,300. $67,700 had gone somewhere, and the only person with signature authority on that account was Victoria Lansing. Rebecca called me on a Sunday evening. She didn't say anything specific on the phone. She just said, "Come to my office Monday morning. Bring every HOA financial document you have going back 4 years." I had them, every newsletter, every budget summary, every dues statement, in a manila folder I'd started keeping from month 3 of living in Meadowbrook. Call it electrician instinct. 33 years of working on systems that could fail catastrophically taught me to keep records of anything that looked like it might one day need to be explained. Victoria had been stealing from the neighborhood to fund a deal that would personally profit her. Rebecca's office smelled of strong coffee and old case files, the comfortable smell of a person who does serious work in a fixed place and doesn't apologize for it. She laid 5 years of HOA financial summaries across her conference table and walked me through them with a mechanical pencil, tapping figures with the quiet focus of someone following a trail. The facility expansion had cost approximately $215,000 per contractor invoices obtained through discovery in Thomas Patterson's civil case. The HOA had authorized $110,000 for the project. The remaining $105,000 had come from a line item Victoria had described in board minutes as external development contributions, no contributor named. The contributor was Summit Ridge Development LLC, a real estate development company that had been quietly acquiring parcels in Riverside County for 4 years, wholly owned by a holding company whose registered agent was Preston Clark, the same attorney currently billing the HOA to fight the grave restoration lawsuit. Read that again because it takes a second to land. The HOA's attorney, the man Victoria had hired to defend the board against the legal consequences of destroying the graves, had a direct financial stake in the company that had paid for the destruction. He had helped arrange the deal and was now helping defend it. In Oregon, that is a textbook conflict of interest under rules of professional conduct. It is also, depending on how the money moved, potentially commercial bribery under state statute. And it answered the question I had been sitting with for months. Why would Victoria, whose entire identity was built on enforcing petty neighborhood rules, destroy a legally recorded deed covenant and eliminate 15 graves for 4 extra golf holes? Because she was getting paid to. Summit Ridge Development had plans for a luxury residential development on a parcel adjacent to Meadowbrook Estates. An expanded 16-hole private golf facility was a central selling point for that development. Victoria had apparently been promised a consulting contract and a seat on the LLC's advisory board. We later confirmed this through deposition. She had been selling out her own neighborhood for a payout she hadn't even collected yet. The $67,700 missing from the facility maintenance reserve, that was her advance, paid to herself through a single-member LLC she had formed 8 months before the facility expansion vote. The LLC was on the Oregon State Secretary of State website. Rebecca found it in under an hour. Third legal nugget, and pay attention to this one. HOA board members are fiduciaries. That is not a technicality. It means they owe a legal duty of loyalty to the residents they represent, the same duty a corporate officer owes to shareholders. Using HOA funds to personally benefit yourself is a breach of fiduciary duty and exposes you to civil liability and potential criminal fraud charges. This is true in virtually every state. Rebecca closed her folder. She looked at me over her coffee mug. She didn't just break the law, she stole from your neighbors to do it. I drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for a while. The wind chimes Daniel had given me, the ones I'd finally put back outside 8 months ago, were moving in the evening air, making that soft, off-key clatter. I thought, okay, time to build the trap. The plan ran on 3 tracks simultaneously: legal, financial, and community. Each piece had to land in sequence, or the whole thing would be a moral victory without teeth, and I had not spent 8 months documenting HOA violations and certified deed records for a moral victory. On the legal track, Rebecca filed a second civil complaint naming Victoria personally, not just as board president, but as an individual for breach of fiduciary duty and self-dealing. She filed a separate complaint with the Oregon Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division regarding the undisclosed financial conflict. Then she filed a complaint with the Oregon State Bar about Preston Clark. On the financial track, Anna Kowalski organized the formal audit demand. Under Oregon's Planned Community Act, homeowners can force an independent financial audit of HOA records by gathering signatures from at least 25% of the membership. We had 73%. Rebecca sent the demand with the signatures attached, 12 pages, certified mail. Victoria had 30 days to comply or face a court order. We knew she'd try to run the clock. We built that into the plan. Gerald Washington handled the community track, and Gerald brought to it the organizational precision of a man who had spent 25 years managing construction schedules. His key insight came from reading the governing documents the way I read electrical schematics, looking not for what was there, but for what wasn't. The governing documents required an annual meeting open to all residents with 30 days written notice, at which the full financial report had to be presented, and residents could vote on board membership. Victoria had been scheduling these at 8 a.m. on Thursdays to suppress attendance, but the governing documents did not specify who had to send the notice. They specified only that written notice had to be delivered to each household. So we delivered it ourselves, a proper governing document compliant notice citing the correct section numbers, listing all required agenda items, referencing the financial report obligation for a community meeting at 8 in the evening on the 3rd Thursday of November at the Riverside Community Center 3 miles away, which Gerald had reserved in his own name. We slid it under every door on a Sunday morning, 2 people per block, and took time-stamped photographs of each delivery. Victoria sent her own notice the next morning, same date, 8 a.m. at the HOA's usual location in her 3-car garage, which meant 2 notices, same date, different times, different venues. Rebecca had anticipated this. Under the governing documents, both meetings were technically valid as noticed, but only one would have a quorum, 45% of households required, and only one would have residents who were actually awake and willing to drive 3 miles to attend. We invited guests to ours. Thomas Patterson drove up from Eugene. Christopher Reyes from The Observer was coming. Investigator Morrison from the State Historic Preservation Office planned to attend as a private citizen. And Rebecca had arranged for a CPA named Douglas Chen, methodical, even-tempered, the kind of man who color-coded spreadsheets not for aesthetics, but because he genuinely believed that clarity was a form of respect, to present the financial audit findings, which he had completed 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Douglas's charts used red for unauthorized expenditures and blue for legitimate HOA spending. When he showed me the draft presentation in his office, I looked at the ratio of red to blue and said something unprintable. Douglas nodded sympathetically and said he had said something similar when he ran the numbers the first time. The community meeting was set. The trap was ready. All that remained was watching it close. Bernard Sullivan asked if there was anything he could do to help. I told him I needed him in the front row at the community meeting, and I needed him to bring the jar of flowers he used to take to the graves. He said he'd press some fresh columbine from his garden, brilliant blue and white, paper-thin petals, the kind that crumple beautifully when they dry. He'd been growing them for 42 years. I told him that was exactly right. The last piece was Stephen Martinez. He sent a formal written request to Victoria to produce the HOA's complete financial records for presentation at the annual meeting. Certified mail, copy to Rebecca, copy to the Riverside County Clerk. Victoria responded in 1 line. She would have her attorney review the request. 24 days left on the audit clock. Victoria spent the 3 weeks before the annual meeting trying to destroy the chessboard. First move, a new attorney, Preston Clark was no longer available for obvious reasons, who filed an emergency motion to invalidate our community meeting notice on the grounds that only the board had authority to call an annual meeting. Rebecca responded in 48 hours with a brief that cited the actual governing document language, which said no such thing, and 4 prior Oregon cases where identical arguments had failed. Judge Margaret Torres denied the motion in 6 sentences. The 5th sentence used the word frivolous. The 6th suggested that continued filings of this nature might warrant sanctions. Second move, and this one was uglier, Victoria began calling residents individually. We learned this the same way you learn everything in a neighborhood, because people talk, and most people talk to someone who talks to someone who talks to Gerald Washington, who talks to me. She was telling people the community meeting was organized by outside interests trying to force unwanted changes on the neighborhood. She was deliberately vague about what those changes were. When pressed, she implied, never stated, always implied, that the goal involved low-income development on the adjacent parcel. I want to be direct about what that was. The Washington family was the only black family in Meadowbrook Estates. The insinuation Victoria was trafficking in those quiet phone calls was not ambiguous to anyone listening carefully. Gerald heard about it within 48 hours because Margaret Stone called him herself, her voice tight with an emotion that sounded like fury and mortification mixed in equal parts. Rebecca documented it in writing and added it to the file. It would come up again. Third move, Victoria hired a private security firm to station personnel at the neighborhood entrance on the evening of the community meeting, with instructions to turn away any non-residents on the grounds that it was a private community event. She was trying to keep Thomas Patterson out, the man whose great-grandfather's grave she had destroyed. She was going to have a security guard turn him away at a residential gate to prevent him from attending a public community meeting about his family's demolished graves. Thomas Patterson arrived at the gate 90 minutes before the meeting with a photographer and a press credential. The security company, it turned out, had been given a job description that omitted several relevant details. When the guard on duty looked up from his clipboard and registered a reporter with a notebook and a photographer with a professional camera, he made a phone call, then another, then stepped aside. Thomas Patterson walked through that gate in his good coat, wire-rimmed glasses catching the parking lot lights, and Christopher Reyes was 3 steps behind him. Inside the community center, the room was filling up, 41 of 48 households represented, comfortably past quorum. The room smelled of old carpet and folding chairs and 4 different kinds of coffee from 4 different thermoses. Thomas Patterson was in the second row. Bernard sat in front with his jar of columbine, brilliant blue and white even under the fluorescent lights, petals thin as paper. I called the meeting to order at 8:03 and immediately handed the floor to Rebecca because I am a retired electrician, not a lawyer, and the next 45 minutes required a lawyer. Rebecca walked the room through the timeline with the unhurried precision of someone who knows the documents are doing the work and her job is simply not to get in the way. Deed covenant, board vote, site clearance, missing $67,700, Preston Clark's conflict of interest, Summit Ridge Development LLC, the advance payment, the Secretary of State filing. She used a projector and scanned documents, numbered, dated, sourced, and she spoke in complete sentences without hedging a single word. Douglas followed with the color-coded charts, red for unauthorized, blue for legitimate. The room made a sound when the red chart came up. Not a gasp exactly, more like the kind of collective exhale you hear when something heavy finally hits the floor. Thomas Patterson stood up. He spoke for 5 minutes and did not raise his voice once. He talked about his great-grandfather, a man who had worked this land for 32 years, been buried on it in 1902, had a headstone with his name on it that had stood for over a century. He talked about driving from Eugene and standing on that raw clay in the October cold. He talked about what it means, not legally, not financially, just as a plain human fact, when the place where your people are buried is looked at by someone with a tablet computer and called an infrastructure impediment. The room was very quiet when he sat down. The vote to remove Victoria Lansing as board president, called under the governing document provision allowing removal of officers for cause, 38-1 with 3 abstentions. Stephen Martinez was voted in as interim president on the same ballot. The vote to retain Rebecca Stone's firm as HOA legal counsel, 39-0. The vote to pursue full restoration of the gravesite, funded from HOA reserves and sought from Victoria Lansing personally in civil recovery for any shortfall, 39-0. It was 9:45 p.m. People were standing in the aisles talking, that particular animated relief of a crowd that has been holding its breath for a long time and has finally been given permission to exhale. The back door opened. Victoria walked in, same business attire she always wore to board meetings, tablet computer under one arm. Her smile in place, present, practiced, her most reliable tool. But something in her had shifted, the way a building shifts before it settles, not visibly collapsed, but no longer quite straight. She looked at the projector screen, still showing Douglas's red and blue chart. She looked at Thomas. She looked at me. "I'd like to address the community," she said. Rebecca looked up from her notes with the pleasant neutrality of a judge who has already issued the ruling. "This meeting has adjourned, Miss Lansing." Victoria stood there for a moment. Then she turned and walked back out the door. The community had spoken, but the real trap was just closing.
The thing about a trap is that by the time it closes, it's already done its work. The community center vote was the ceremony. The trap had been running for 3 months before that, quietly, and it closed on a Thursday morning in January at the Riverside County Administration Building. The Oregon Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation in November, triggered by Rebecca's complaint to the Consumer Protection Division and accelerated by Douglas Chen's audit, which he had forwarded directly with a cover letter that was, by all accounts, 5 pages of the most precise and devastating accountant prose ever produced in Riverside County. The investigation covered HOA financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to defraud homeowners, naming Victoria Lansing, Preston Clark, and Summit Ridge Development LLC. On that Thursday, Victoria was served with civil process in the parking lot of a grocery store 9 miles from Meadowbrook Estates. She left her shopping cart where it stood. Christopher Reyes published the story that evening. He included the detail about the abandoned cart. I did not feel bad about appreciating that detail. The civil lawsuit Rebecca filed on behalf of the neighborhood and Thomas Patterson specifically named Victoria as an individual, named Preston Clark, and named Summit Ridge Development LLC. It sought recovery of the $67,700 in missing reserve funds, the full cost of gravesite restoration, compensatory damages for the Patterson, Washington, and Kowalski families, and punitive damages, available in Oregon when a defendant's conduct is willful, malicious, and contemptuous of others' legal rights. Rebecca pursued the punitive claim with focused enthusiasm. Preston Clark's disciplinary hearing concluded in the spring. His license was suspended for 22 months. The written decision used the phrase profound conflict of interest twice and failure of professional judgment 4 times. He relocated to a different state to resume practice. But the moment, the single clear visual moment that lives in my memory as the real ending, did not happen in an administration building. It happened on a cold Saturday in March on the southeastern corner of the Meadowbrook Estates property under an Oregon winter sky the color of old steel. Frozen ground, bare trees, the kind of cold that settles into your collar and stays. Gerald Washington had organized the restoration crew, 14 volunteers in work gloves and insulated boots, breath fogging in the still air. The State Historic Preservation Office had completed its forensic analysis and located each of the 15 burial plots precisely. New headstones, granite, permanent, and engraved from historical records and Thomas Patterson's family documents had been funded from the recovered HOA reserves, with the shortfall covered by a personal contribution from Stephen Martinez, who said quietly at the planning meeting that he should have spoken up 3 years sooner. Thomas was there. Bernard was there, in his wool coat and his late wife's knitted scarf, leaning on his cane, mason jar of fresh columbine in his hand. Blue and white and paper-thin, brilliant against the gray morning. The Washington family came, the Kowalskis came, Margaret Stone came. 33 households were represented, which is most of them, which is the neighborhood. Investigator Morrison was there. Christopher Reyes was there. 2 Portland news cameras stood at a respectful distance. I was there. Victoria Lansing was not. She had moved out of Meadowbrook Estates 8 weeks earlier into a rental in a different county while her attorneys managed her legal exposure. Her house stood empty, her lawn was overgrown, technically in violation of Governing Document Section 7.2. Stephen Martinez, our new board president, had decided the neighborhood had more important priorities than citing empty houses. When the first headstone was set into the restored earth, James Patterson, 1834 to 1902, beloved father and steward of this land, Thomas put his hand on it. He held it there for a long moment. Then he stepped back and looked up at the bare tree canopy, the branches tracing black lines against the steel sky. Someone played a hymn softly from a phone speaker, an old folk tune, thin and clear in the cold. Thomas had chosen it. I was standing next to Bernard Sullivan. He smelled of pipe tobacco and wool, and the columbine in his jar was very bright, and neither of us said anything for a while, because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying for itself. That was it. Not the lawsuit, not the AG investigation, not the vote, not Victoria's abandoned shopping cart. It was 15 headstones going back into the ground where they belonged, surrounded by people who had decided that some things matter more than being comfortable. Turns out that's a majority. Here's where things landed. Victoria Lansing settled the civil suit 16 months later for $247,000, the missing reserve funds, full gravesite restoration costs, legal fees, and a portion of damages for the Patterson, Washington, and Kowalski families. The AG's office extracted a separate resolution. Victoria pled guilty to a misdemeanor count of financial exploitation of a homeowners association, paid fines, performed community service, and was legally barred from serving on any HOA board in Oregon for 20 years. Her LLC was dissolved. Preston Clark's license suspension held on appeal. The disciplinary board's written decision is a matter of public record if you're curious. Summit Ridge Development LLC and its associated holding companies became the subject of a broader regulatory review of development practices in Riverside County. The luxury residential development never broke ground. The adjacent parcel was purchased by the county 3 years later and converted to a nature preserve. There are walking trails now. They are well maintained. Gerald Washington served as interim board president for 2 years before stepping aside for a newly elected board, 4 women and 3 men, all people who were in that community center room, all people who carried something in their faces that I can only describe as the specific thoughtfulness of people who have been through something hard and paid attention. The restored cemetery is maintained by the community now. Small wrought iron fence, gravel path, good drainage. In the spring, someone always leaves flowers. Sometimes it's me. I still drive the 2010 Silverado. The faded paint is still there. The wind chimes are outside where they belong, and on a quiet evening you can hear them from the front yard, that soft off-key clatter Daniel picked out because he thought his old man needed more music in his life. He was right about that. As it turns out, he's right about most things. $247,000. That's the number Victoria signed her name next to before this was over. Not because she wanted to, because there was nothing left to argue. Here's what I want you to take away from this story. Not the settlement, not the vote, not even the moment her attorney stopped returning calls. The moment that mattered was when I drove to the county record office, spent $23, and pulled a document that had been sitting in that filing system since 1971. Then I made 7 copies. That was the beginning of the end for Victoria Lansing. Her power never came from being right. It came from nobody bothering to check whether she was right. The moment one person checked, really checked, 8 years of unchallenged authority started coming apart. If you live in an HOA right now, I want to ask you something directly. Have you actually read your governing documents? Not skimmed them, read them. Because whoever your Victoria is, she's betting that you haven't. Don't give her that. If this story means something to you, share it, because somewhere out there right now, somebody just got a violation notice for nothing, and they need to know that $23 can change everything. Drop a comment. What has your HOA done that brought you here tonight? Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. She called them infrastructure impediments. Turns out, the only impediment was her.